Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for your patience. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and I will be with you for the next hour or so as we continue our way through Mark chapter 13. Last week, we did just one verse. I expect we'll do probably 3 this time. I apologize. I neglected to put the handout in the usual place of the GoToWebinar upload spot. So it is in the tinyurl.com/mark translation notes. So sorry about that. You'll have to take a couple extra steps this time. But if you go to the link that I sent you in the chat just now, or you can just go to tinyurl.com/mark translation notes. Let me know if you have any issues with that. You can go, I'll just show you what this looks like in accordance. If you go to File, New Tab, web browser, and if you just copy and paste what I put in there, that is a link to the Google Drive, which the tiny URL also links to, and that will give you access to this handout. So you can view it there, you can also download it, and this will be coming your way as well from Linda later on this afternoon. So again, sorry about that, and thanks for your patience. But if you just click that link, I'll put it in the chat one more time so you've got it. But you can also get it from tinyurl.com/mark translation notes. Let me know if any issues with that, and then we will jump into our webinar today. You who have been here before know that this translation note series focuses on the lexical and grammatical questions that arise when translating the Greek text of Mark into English. And so this is not a feature-heavy webinar, although we do use lots of accordance features. This is much more applied use of accordance for a specific task, which is translating the Greek text into English. And those are the two focuses. We'll look at the word level quite a bit. What does this word mean? We had to do that last week with this abomination of desolation phrase. Neither of those are terribly common words. And then the grammatical questions that come up. We had some of that last week too, a mismatch, well, an apparent mismatch in gender in a participle that we had to make some sense of. So those questions come up each week and we address them together, adopting, at least from my end, a translation philosophy of wanting to be as faithful to the Greek text as possible and still be readable in English. And we see that no language is like a decoder ring when going from one to the other. There's never really a one-on-one translation, but we get as close as we can in a way that makes sense. So with that said, I just want to highlight here on the first page, just kind of by way of overview of what we did last week. This is verse 14 of Mark 13, a pretty well-known verse, maybe not culturally outside of the world of religious studies or biblical studies or the church or anything like that. But within biblical studies, this has been an interpretive challenge ever since these words were uttered. So we talked about that. I'm not going to go over that again this week because I do want to move forward. But if you've got questions or comments or any insights that have come up since last week, I'd love to hear them. You can use the questions box to type your questions. That's like a one-way typed chat, and I will see those and respond to them either privately or with the group, always quoting you anonymously. So that's Mark 13:14, and I'm just including again the SIL exegetical summary series comment that speaks to the when, because I think that's one of the interpretive questions that's kind of always there in this passage. And we've explored that already. We'll continue to look at that. We'll dip into that a little bit today at the very end, just because Jesus will say in those days, and we're going to at least approach the question again, but we probably won't spend as much time on that this week as we have in the past. But this is a nice series because it summarizes major commentaries and translations, and you'll see here how different sources have interpreted this when question. In particular, this comes from verse 14. And so the answers here, you could broaden them out and apply them to the whole passage, maybe. but there are more considerations when you do that. This question and answer here is specifically for the verse that describes the abomination of desolation and those in Judea fleeing to the mountains. So the three basic schools of thought that are summarized here are: this is before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is a future event at the end of the age. And then some say it's both. And there may be other views even within that that you could suss out. But that's getting us up to where we are today. We are in this, in fact, you can see here the NA28 and the UBS, there's a comma at the end of verse 14. I've started a new sentence in verse 15, but really what we get today is a continuation of what's in verse 14. So there are this presenting event, or probably surrounded by lots of events, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, and then we talked about this aside, let the reader understand, then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And we're going to get more. And the one on the roof must not go down or go inside to get anything out of his house. Verse 16, and the one in the field must not go back to get his coat. Verse 17, but woe to the ones who are pregnant and nursing in those days. So it's all a continuation of verse 14. So there are specific instructions for people that are in some specific scenarios. So if you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. If you're on the roof, don't go back into the house. If you are in the field, don't go back for your coat. If you are pregnant and nursing, woe to you. And we're kind of going to stop mid-thought. There's a little bit more that develops this in verse 18 and onward. But the idea is, don't go back, just get out of there. And you might even argue, this is all overview before we dive in, you might even make the point that let those in Judea flee to the mountains governs verse 15 and 16, in the sense that there's an implication. If you're on the roof, you must not go down or go inside to get anything before you flee to the mountains. In other words, you could look at verse 15 by itself, but Jesus and Mark are not saying just stay on the roof. Implied is that there's a fleeing going on, and that carries over to verse 16 as well. The one in the field must not go back to get his coat. Well, where are they going to that they're not supposed to go back? I think it's here, fleeing to the mountains, which you could take that literally and you could understand metaphorically. The idea is just get out of there. And then same in verse 17, woe to the ones who are pregnant and nursing. We'll talk about that more when we get there. So that's an overview. Let's dive in verse by verse. Here's verse 15, and I'm going to go to accordance for this. Let me open up an NA28. In fact, you know, you could do, I mean, I like having the PDF open separately, but you could always, through the, because these are on, they're hosted on the internet, you can use your web browser to access these handouts. You could just have it open like that if you wanted to. Let's go to Mark 13:14. All right. So we've got verse 15. Ha de epitudomatos, me katabato, me de esilthato, arai ti ektes oikias autu. And we'll just try a provisional left to right translation first. But or and the one on the roof or rooftop or housetop, let not or must not go down, and also not or nor go in to get anything, T, from the house, from his house, or from that person's house. We begin with ha, the one, masculine, singular, nominative. This can stand in for any person. And so I like the one for translation here. It just means anybody who happens to be on their roof. If this is you, here's what to do, or rather, here's what not to do. The day here is in brackets because textually it's not certain. it's not 100%. It doesn't rise to the level of it's just in the text as we've compiled it in the NA28 or the UBS. There's certainly manuscripts that don't have it. There are other manuscripts that have chi instead. You could decide to let this go untranslated. That would be called pleonastic. And so it's there, but it does, the chi doesn't always need to be translated. The de can be treated the same way. Or you can translate it either as but or and. I think in this case, and would be the better of the two translations because it's a continuation of a similar thought. It doesn't contrast with let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Not like it says, but let those in Syria do something else. It's saying, and if you're on the roof, don't go down first, don't go inside first. So that's how I would render de. I tend to favor, if it's in brackets in the NA28 or something, I might just keep it that way in my translation. All right, so what about this one? Where is this one? Where is this person? And I'm going to use the diagrams for this, just so we can get a sense of how this all fits together. Here's our first clause. We've got ha, so that's, you can see here, remember that this horizontal line is split by this vertical line. At left is the subject, and its modifiers. At right is the predicate, which is everything that is said about the subject. So whatever verb and modifiers, that's all there. So we get a fairly simple subject, the one, and then epitudomatos, the one who is on the roof. And then here's what this person should not do. So the one on the roof, or the one who is on the roof, we've got epitudomatos. Doma, we can look that up in BDAG by triple clicking. 1, 2, 3. And it says the level surface of a flat roof. And then you may remember the bold here is the definition, and then the bold in italics is the translation equivalent, also called the gloss. This is a great guide because it's giving you a full-on definition, but it's saying in your translation, you would not say, let the one on the level surface of a flat roof and so forth. That would be rather bulky. Instead, roof, housetop would be the way to go for a translation equivalent. So that is what you've got there in BDAG, roof, housetop. Think about how you want to do that. It's mentioned here, but I've got, I think I just did roof here. Different translations will vary. An interesting note from the NET, the New English Translation, it says most of the roofs in the New Testament were flat roofs made of pounded dirt, sometimes mixed with lime or stones, supported by heavy wooden beams. They generally had an easy means of access, either a sturdy wooden ladder or stone stairway, sometimes on the outside of the house. I bring that in to this webinar because it answers a question I had. The one on the roof must not go down or go inside to get anything. So you can understand that two ways. The one on the roof must not go down or go inside the house for the purpose of getting anything, but they can go down or go inside for the purpose of getting out. That's one way of understanding it. Or you could look at the diagrams and think of it this way: you must not go down into the house or go inside of the house, period. And you would do that to go get something, but don't go down, don't go in at all. I'm not sure it's the text itself is clear on this, but if it's that second understanding, and I don't think this affects translation, the question is, well, how do you get off the roof? And the NET note answers that. Generally an easy means of access, either a sturdy wooden ladder or stone stairway, sometimes on the outside of the house. So we are hoping that is the case if the one on the roof is supposed to go out of there quickly. The text just doesn't elaborate on exactly how that's meant to happen. And I think the point is less the logistics and more the urgency. It's just another way of saying, get out of there, flee to the mountains, run to the hills, both literally and metaphorically. Let's look at me katabato, me de esilthato. And as always, if you've got questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. So we've got these two imperative, third person singular imperative verbs, both of them negated. So we have the negation there and here. So it's a neither nor kind of thing. You could think about if you want to bring it out as neither nor in English. That is grammatically correct and I think readable enough. I think in more colloquial English, that feels a little more formal. So you might consider something like must not go down or go inside to get anything. But you could say the one on the roof must neither go down nor go inside to get anything out of his house. Both of these verbs, as I've said, they're third person singular imperative. That's an interesting form. We have it in English too. Usually when we talk about imperative verbs, we might think more in the second person, like I'm talking to you and I say, hand me that screwdriver so I can, screw this thing into the wall or something like that, or go outside. But the third person singular is still a command, but it's given to not a direct addressee. And you could either translate that as let not, shall not, must not. There may be other ways to do that. And again, we have this in English. Probably the most famous example would be let them eat cake. So just think about how you want to render that. I like must here just because it communicates the urgency of it, and it is a command. It's not saying the one on the roof probably shouldn't go down, but it's saying must not. Let that person not, don't do it, but you have to have a way to say that in the third person. So there are different options here, but I like must not go down. So what must they not do? I mean, what is it that would draw them down or inside? And the next phrase, let me just go back to accordance here. It's arai t, to get anything. So there's an infinitive. The t is just like stuff. I mean, it's about as generic a word as you can get, but it means anything here. Ek tes oikias autu, from or out of the house, that person's house. That's modifying the let them not, or let that person not go down, let them not enter, let them not go inside of the house. And just a note here, autu is masculine, so is ha in gender. We may just note if this doesn't come out in translation, just an awareness, nothing indicates this is directed to male humans only. Not only that, but it's singular, and the ha at the beginning of the verse is definite, but that doesn't mean it's talking about only one single person. This is any person who is on the roof. And I think the one communicates that just fine. You could say anyone or whoever is on the roof, but I think in English, we say the one, and that's definite, but it still communicates whichever one happens to be on the roof. So the idea here is that we've got masculine and we've got singular, but really what's being described is anyone who's on the roof, wherever they may be, whoever they may be, whatever roof that may be, they must not go down into the house to get anything. And the corollary here would be like if the house is on fire, maybe you've been in awkward icebreaker situations where somebody says, as a get to know you, your house is on fire. Oh, thank you. That's a pleasant thought. What two things would you grab out of your house? Which is an interesting values question to pose, but the general thinking is get your people, your pets, and get out, and don't get any stuff. So this is kind of taking that same approach. Don't even go back. Just get out of there. And I noted this already. We'll stop here for any comments you have or questions. We don't really need to look into this for translation per se, but there is some research you could do here in terms of the roof and what was a typical house like. And I would just personally, for my own peace of mind, before I finish this translation, I would want to confirm, could a person actually escape a house from the roof without going back inside first? I mean, the verse seems to presuppose that, unless the verse is saying just jump off no matter how high you are. I don't know that that's the point. But I think the NET note already gets to that, the idea up here that there generally was an easy means of access. Think about a fire escape in more modern terms. So there, a sturdy wooden ladder or a stone stairway, they note. This is probably a good place to check your background commentaries. I'll just add parallel info pane. And I might even just look at Craig Keener here, the IVP New Testament background commentary. And sure enough, this answers my question. He says housetops were flat and could be used for prayer, drying vegetables, chatting with neighbors, and so forth, because one approached them by an outdoor staircase, there we go, or ladder, and not from indoors. One who fled in haste would descend without entering the house to retrieve any possession. So this even means there's not, according to Keener, even a way to go from the roof directly into the house. So it's not like there's an entrance from house to roof. There's a little bit more deliberateness involved, as Keener describes it, to go from the house back downstairs through the outside exit and into the house to get your stuff and go back, according to Keener. And then what Jesus is saying is just get out of there. Keener notes too, even if there is an element of hyperbole, it graphically underlines the point of urgency. And that really is the point that I think most needs to come across in translation, regardless of whether you give it roof, rooftop, housetop. I think this idea of must ought to come out here. And you could even say that one on the roof ought not to go down. That's still consistent with the third person imperative, but the urgency I think here is important. So think about how you can bring that out in translation. One wonders too, this go down and go inside, it could have been just one verb. Really what's described here is one action. It's the idea of don't look back, don't go back, just get out of there. And again, I think if that gets communicated in your translation, that's, in terms of the idea of it, that's probably the most important thing. All right, let's stop and see what questions or comments you've got on verse 15. This was easier thematically than verse 14, partly because it's developing a theme that we've already looked at some. The vocabulary was a little bit of a challenge, not too bad. We needed to look at doma for roof. The grammar was pretty straightforward, so especially after verse like 14, when you're reading and translating, it's always nice to have that, and we'll get that actually in the next two verses as well. Let's pause for your comments or questions. Here, I'll put this in the chat for folks to see. Somebody says, when we tour Israel, we see lots of first century houses with external stairs to rooftop if the roof is still there. Awesome. All right, so you've got a, not just a theoretical image of this, but have actually seen physically what this looks like. That's great. Yeah, and I think just another interesting thing here, again, this doesn't have to come out in translation per se, but just to understand it, this is not, I mean, depending on where you live in the world, you know, people hanging out on their roofs, yeah, like if you've got a pitched roof and you live like out in the suburbs, that's probably not really a thing that people do. But I mean, urban settings may have more rooftop stuff. But I think something more similar today would be people, you know, hanging out on their porches or on their back deck or something like that. I would not put that into your translation because that's not what the verse is saying. But as you're maybe talking to other people about this or just thinking about it for yourself, the idea is that you're at home and you're doing something maybe recreational. At the least, you're relaxed, but now you need to get out of there. All right, let's move on. The comments, questions, welcome at any time. Of course, we'll move on to verse 16. More continuation. Remember verse 14. I think this idea of fleeing to the mountains is still in play here. If you're on the roof, don't go back, basically. And verse 16, and the one in the field must not go back to get his coat. Same thought, just a different scenario, a different physical setting. Let's look at this verse in accordance. All right, so we had a comma there. Kai ha estan agron me epistrepsato esta opiso arai ta himation autu. And the one in the field, not let him, or not let that one, or that one must not turn back. We'll unpack this phrase in a bit. To get or to take, same verb arai as we had in verse 15. So these are very much parallel. Ta himation autu, his cloak, his garment, his jacket. Let's see, I think Keener talks about outer coats. Loss of the cloak represented a serious difficulty. Yeah, and again, this is about indicating haste. Preserving life takes priority over the most crucial possessions. So whatever is important in your house, and I mean, maybe everything is important in your house, but like, don't even go back for the safe box or the expensive instruments or the family photos. And then verse 16, don't even go back for your cloak, which you typically have with you. Leave your wallet and your keys if you want to get modern about it. Similar thing in verse 16. And we have this ha again, so there's a parallelism there as well. Further development of instructions for folks in various scenarios. Estan agron is what we've got here. We notice the root here. We get agriculture, agrarian from this same Greek root, in the field. Ace, you may have learned in vocabulary, it's one of those prepositions that can have multiple glosses or translation equivalents. I tend to think of it more as into, but it can mean in. That meaning is in BDAG. It is worth looking at. BDAG is a wonderful resource, and it's especially helpful for prepositions. And this may be something you want to spend time on. It may not be. You may just want a good translation equivalent and move on. But BDAG has you covered either way. This is going to be a pretty lengthy article on the word ace. So all the ways it could be used, and again, you can just decide if you want to read that. But accordance, when you triple click to your default lexicon, if you've got it set to do so, it will also include reference when amplifying from text to tool. So we're looking up, amplifying, triple clicking to get there, something from a text in a tool, and we've got include reference checked. So it looked up ACE in BDAG, and thankfully it had the verse in question. I triple clicked from Mark 13:16. Concordance knows that. So it searched the entry and it searched for the scripture reference. Now for prepositions, this is going to be hit or miss, probably mostly miss because your prepositions occur a lot. So, just statistically, the chances that your given verse will be listed there are probably slim, but it's included here. And so we might just scroll up. It's this first one, extension involving a goal or place. And this is what I mean by, this is a definition. This is not how you would translate ACE, but it is answering the question, it's basically answering the question, what does in mean? What does ace mean without using the word to define it? And then you get the translation equivalents here, into, in, toward, and to. And then you get the reference here with the sub-definition of a position within a certain area. You could read through this, and here's their translation, he who is in the field. So they take the ha masculine and render it he rather than the one. Own, that participle being implied, the one in the field. And you could say the one in the field or the one who is in the field, either way. And then it gives Mark 13:16. You don't even really need to do that much because you can also just ask the question, what prepositions in English would describe one's relationship to a field? That's going to be constricted by what ace can mean, but it would not be the one into the field. That just doesn't make sense. where are you in relation to a field? Well, yeah, I guess you could be on a field, but that doesn't, and ace doesn't really permit that meaning, and that doesn't make sense anyway. So the one in the field, and again, there's just a world of information on a preposition like this in BDAG if you're interested. But the one in the field must not go back. We have another may, so a negation, strong negation with epistrepsato, aorist active imperative, third person singular again. And because it's may plus third person singular imperative, I would just want to do a consistency check with my translation, because we've got the ha in verse 15, ha in verse 16. These are running in parallel to each other. And so I want to be consistent with how I translate the imperative. Remember, it could be let not, shall not, ought not, whatever I did in verse 15, in this case, must not, I want to replicate if possible in verse 16. So the one in the field must not go back to get his coat. And by the way, on may, I mentioned that's a strong negation. That's another word the BDAG will give you a nice long entry on. There is oo for the negative particle and may, and you could look at this, I mean, it may not necessarily be a stronger negation. It can also have to do with the moods. You could look at this in the grammar. Different ones go with different verbs sometimes. But this again will be another interesting article, and like I said, any grammar will talk about the difference between the two. But because of the urgency of the passage, pretty clear to me, I want a must level of urgency in translating the third person singular and must not with the negation there. We get this interesting phrase, and so if we take it all together, me epistrepsato eis ta opiso, I think I have an errant mark there, must not return to the back, or must not go back to get his coat. It comes across as a little redundant. In other words, I think this could just have said me epistrepsato. This verb can already in itself mean turn around, go back. And so the back here is maybe already encoded in the verb. For whatever reason, Mark, Jesus brings out eis ta opiso. I don't know that we can conclude that's for emphasis or not, maybe. BDAG doesn't really give us an explanation of it. It just says that it's there. But either way, I think must not go back comes out in translation, whether that eis ta opiso is required grammatically or not. And in fact, there are a few manuscripts that omit it, which makes me think that other manuscripts were at least asking that question or wondering about it. Or maybe it wasn't, I mean, just didn't make it to those manuscripts for other reasons. But you can see here, right here, that this, you've got some manuscripts where this is not there. So the words, clauses, or sentences between these signs, we've got the raised square and the dash or the slash are omitted by the witnesses cited. And this may be, more detailed than you're interested in for a translation. It's possible SIL Exegetical Summary Series would speak to this as well, but it may not. Yeah, see, already in epistrape, so you've got go back, come back, turn to the rear. So I would just translate it as must not go back, and personally I would carry on with the verse, finding some level of comfort that other manuscripts don't have it there. So yes, I'm not wrong to see epistrepsato and think it could stand alone grammatically, because it could. So what would the person go back for? Well, in the case of the house, it would be to get anything awry, anything out of his house. Here it is also to get something more specific, to get his cloak. And we could speculate about this. I think presumably if you're in the field, you can't get all your stuff because you don't have all your stuff with you, but you probably have your coat or your cloak with you. So don't go back to get it. Again, the question arises, where where are you going that you wouldn't go back? And I think this still goes back to fleeing to the mountains, which is a way of saying actually flee to the mountains, and also saying get out of there. So you need to leave that field, but don't go back for your coat. Don't go back for anything. I mean, if your coat is already at your feet, can you pick it up and take it with you? Yeah. But if you have to travel across a field in the opposite direction, there's no time for that. Again, the point here is the urgency, and the urgency is because you have to flee because of this abomination of desolation. So we're right back at that. This thing is so bad and so not where it should be, things not as they should be, that the way that you need to respond is to get out. So that's being emphasized further here with this verse. All right, not a very long verse, but it certainly makes the point, and we can stop there and see if you've got comments or questions on verse 16. And I'll just see if SIL Exegetical Summary Series has anything. And see, they actually put these two verses together, which is as it should be. Yeah, you get more comment here on the housetop in the SIL Exegetical Summary Series. Oh, and this too, and I see a comment or question. We'll come right to that in just a minute. This is interesting. Does the instruction for the man or the one on the housetop not to go down mean that he is to remain on the housetop? So that's back to that question about, is there a way to get off? And you certainly must go down to the ground in order to flee. Yeah, so you've got some different answers here. But again, the larger point, the danger is so great that people should flee without even stopping to gather up their possessions. And this person, the field worker, would get the garment because it would be highly desirable at night. According to this, any delay might mean being captured, turned back, or perhaps killed, or exploded or burned, or whatever's going to happen here in this moment. All right, let's see what questions or comments folks have. Put this in the chat. Somebody says, I have heard not go back implies don't even go across the field, no time. Yep, urgent to leave now. It does not need to imply back to the house. Yeah, okay, interesting. Yep. Yeah, for sure. All right. Now, verse 17, and we don't talk a whole lot in this series about paragraph divisions. The NA28 and I think the UBS as well, and actually, I guess the UBS, I thought it ended it here. Maybe it's just the NA28. You get a paragraph break after verse 17. The SIL Exegetical Summary Series groups 17 and 18 together. We'll probably just do 17 today. At least that's what I've got prepared for us. But that's a question to consider too. And just to look at these in translation briefly, we're about to see, and woe to the ones having a child in the womb and the ones nursing in those days. But pray that it not happen in winter. So the question is, does verse 18 go with verse 17, or does it go back to verse 14 and go with the whole passage? I think it goes with the whole passage. Pray that it would not happen. Well, what's the it? We'll look at this more next week. But I think it's pray that all of these things, all of this stuff would not happen. In fact, SIL Exegetical Summary Series will ask the question, what are they supposed to pray will not happen? The time of their flight. They should pray that their flight does not happen in the winter. So I think that goes back to the fleeing in verse 14. So we will come back to verse 18 next week. Maybe we can look at it as maybe a better place to end a paragraph than here. But for now, verse 17. So we've got people fleeing, not going back. Let me clean up this workspace a little bit here. Go back to those diagrams. I like to have those handy sometimes. Yeah, verse 18 is here, but let's go to verse 16, which is next. And the Chi here shows us that we really could, sorry, let me just make sure I'm in the right verse. Okay, scratch that. Start a new sentence. So here we are with woe, y de tais en gastri ekusais, kai tais thelazousais, en ekenas tais hemerais. Woe, but woe or and woe to those in the womb having. We can see in the diagram what's going on here. Woe to those having in the womb, and to those nursing in those days. Woe to the ones, but woe to the ones who are pregnant and nursing in those days. We'll come to the word pregnant in just a moment, but let's start at the beginning. We've got day for but or and. We've got this woe word, which occurs much more frequently in Matthew and Luke than in Mark. I thought this would be a good time, personally, as I was getting ready for today, to look at this word, because I thought, I know that Jesus gives out some woes to people, pronounces woes on them, but I didn't remember seeing them in Mark very much up to this point. So right-click, search for lexeme, and what you see here is, and I'll just open up a translation to have in parallel. In Matthew, you've got woe to Chorazin, to Bethsaida, woe to the world, woe to you experts in the law and you Pharisees, blind guides, and so on. This is all Matthew. And then we get to Mark, and this is the first woe. So that is why I sort of did a double take, like, yeah, where are they? Well, they're not. Mark just has two uses of this particular word. It's not to say there couldn't be other ways Mark would express this or Jesus would express this, but this woe word occurs just twice in Mark. You see it in Luke. It's in Luke 6, Jesus preaching, and again, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and the woes to the religious leaders here. Nothing in John, and then you'll see it again in Revelation. By the way, if you wanted to look at this in a table, you could go to your analytics and book chapter stats. You could do either table, or you could even do a table chart if you wanted that visual. Average hits, but I want to do total hits. So 13 times in Matthew, just twice in Mark, 15 in Luke. Revelation has woe a good amount, but anyway, just an interesting observation. Again, this had nothing really to do with translation per se, but accordance makes it relatively easy and not very time consuming to satisfy any curiosity we might have, which in my case was, has Mark used this word before? And the answer is no, he's only using it once more. And Mark does not have those same passages unless he uses a different word, but I don't think the parallels are even there either. So we've got that more in Matthew and Luke. The question still remains, what does woe mean? I think that may be an easy enough to understand word in English that you just go with woe, which is what you'll see here in the instant details and interjection. You might triple click and find it in BDAG. And then again, here's the definition: interjection denoting pain or displeasure. And I really don't know. I mean, you could say, alas, for those who are pregnant. Yeah, I guess you could say too bad, although that almost sounds, I'm not sure that quite carries the same weight. This is probably one of those words where I would say, I would defend a more traditional translation like woe, even at the risk of being, sounding archaic to a typical reader in 2025 in English language that may or may not know that word. I just think it's such a good translation, and maybe this is a good place to kind of explain that as you're working through the translation, or put it in your own notes or something like that. So woe to them. And to whom is the woe issued? Well, it's tais en gastri ekusais, those in womb having. And that is an idiom for the ones who are pregnant. They have, what do they have in womb? Well, they've got a to be born baby in their womb. So you can just render that as the ones who are pregnant, those who are pregnant and nursing. So that then expands the scope of the woe. This word for nursing, thelasso, occurs just 5 times. You could even, I'm just curious where else that occurs. Out of the mouths of children and nursing infants, you have prepared praise for yourself. And then we get this, the synoptic parallels here in Matthew. In verse 27 of Luke 11, we get something different, and then we get another parallel here. But yeah, it means to nurse or to breastfeed. You could do either of those in translation. Those words are pretty much interchangeable in English. So woe to those who are pregnant, or woe to the ones who are pregnant and nursing in those days. And ekanais tais chimerais. You could word search this again, as we did in Mark 13:11. We had something similar. It was not quite the same thing. It was an ekene te hora, in that hour. It raises the question again, and I make no pretense of being able to answer this conclusively if 2,000 years of interpretation has not been able to. But it does raise the question again of which days. When are those days? This phrase itself can have a far off eschatological sense. You would see this in the prophets who are predicting what is apparently a far off future, but the prophets also predicted a near future. And it can have a mundane sense, or it can be both. And this kind of gets back to what was up at the top of the handout here, this when question. It could be one or the other, or it could be both, or something somewhere in between. I don't know that this needs a whole lot of attention for this particular verse. I think the idea is, the most immediate referent is, if the question is in what days, well, you just scroll up. It's in the days that people are running because of what? The abomination of desolation, standing where it should not be. In those days, namely the days in which the abomination of desolation is standing where it should not be, in those days, woe to those who are pregnant and nursing at that time. In other words, woe to the ones who are pregnant and nursing when the abomination of desolation is where it should not be. That, I'm fairly certain, is how you interpret verse 17. That still leaves the question, maybe it punts it a little bit to the when, but then you're at least tied back to verse 14. In other words, I don't think that in those days here is any different from the when of the rest of 14, 15, 16, and 17. But this is worth a word search if you like. And you might just think about how to construct this, because it will not find Mark 13:11, because that said in that hour. But if you go to verse 17, just so that this will be some feature specific stuff, you could search this, right click, search for lexeme. You could actually start by searching for inflected, and that will give you, it will put it in quotes, and it will give you in those days. And you see here in Mark 1:9, I talked about this mundane sense. Now in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John. That is a very specific historical sense. It's not, I mean, there's nothing mundane about Jesus's baptism, but this is not being used for a far off future. The same thing in Mark 8:1. In those days, there was another large crowd. It's like saying one day. But then we have verse 17. We have this again in verse 24. And then we have in verse 24, in those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. So there's something there. Verse 35, this seems to be a more, I don't know if it's far off, but it's definitely a future looking big deal kind of those days. And then you've got another couple uses in Luke. And then you could also switch your search text to the Septuagint to look at this same phrase and see if you've got it anywhere. There's not much here. So I would now, for the next part of the search, right click and search for lexeme, because you may get in that day. And that may give you more to work with. That will include in those days. You could see if that gives you any more for the Septuagint. And it sure does. Now, there's not necessarily time to do this now, but there is the question of, is in that day the same thing as in those days? Are they ever used interchangeably? I mean, I didn't find any results for this phrase in the plural just now. But the other thing to consider is that you've got this intervening article here and this preposition here really for this search, and this would be my third step. So my first step was I searched for inflected, New Testament, Septuagint. My second step was I searched for lexeme, New Testament, and Septuagint. Now what I want to do is maybe make this a little bit less, like maybe just do it without the article. So maybe just do in that day, and I might even add a within here or something like that to play with that. This gives me a good chance to plug the searches webinar that we've been doing on different ways to search in accordance. And so you might just spend some time thinking through different ways to get at these words, maybe within, actually, I'm gonna have to right click and enter command here. Maybe just do within 2 words. Now I lost my other Greek. Let's put that in there. So that may broaden out your search a little bit more. But anyway, this is worth looking at. I don't think it's, you know, I think for this particular verse, like I said, I think the when question is clear insofar as it's describing those days when the abomination of desolation is standing where it should not be. And you've got in those days in English for enekainis tais hemerais. That's not a hard translation, not a tough decision. I think you're good and you move on. But if you're curious, that's how I would construct that search and start to understand what's going on here and see if I can continue to kind of chip away at that question of when here. But I think maybe where I would want to spend more time with this is where we saw this in verse 24. Where you've got not only the abomination, but you've also got the sun and the moon and some celestial changes taking place as well. I might want to revisit the phrase then, which we will. God willing, we will get to verse 24 at some point. Next time, we'll move ahead into verse 18. Let's just, we looked at that already briefly. This is a short verse. Pray that it may not happen. Pray in order that it may not happen in winter. That's not going to take us a super long time to work on, but we'll go further next time because we've got Hi Hemerai Akenai. So there's those days again. And so if we had taken the time to construct a more flexible search, we would have found this, or we could just read on. So we've got that. There's going to be suffering and yet more. Look, here is the Christ. Look, there he is. Do not believe them. So we'll forge on. I don't think we'll do all of the rest of this section next time, but we'll probably get through verse 23 within a couple of weeks. All right, let me stop and see what comments or questions folks have, and we'll wrap up. I have put, and if you want to take some time to articulate questions or comments, but it's been a little while since I've included this, but I put at the end of the handout today a list of recommended commentaries for Greek Mark, RT France's NIGTC volume. These are all hyperlinked and they'll take you to the pages in the Accordance store. William Lane, NICNT, the SIL Exegetical Summary Series, Mark Strauss, his Zondervan Exegetical Commentary, Stein in Baker, and then of course Best Commentaries has some recommendations, but any of these we could have spent more time with today. I find myself going to France time and time again, and in the info pane you can order your commentaries so that these ones show up earlier in your search, but let's just in the last couple of minutes we can look at France here. He says in Akenais tais Hemerais must refer back either to the time when the Bdelugma tes Eremoseos, the abomination of desolation, is seen, or to the period of flight for those in Judea. So as I've said, verse 14, Since the latter is to follow immediately on the former, it makes little difference. In other words, all of the events of 14, when the abomination shows up and people flee, that's all the same time. And the flight to the hills will be particularly hard for pregnant women and nursing mothers. And winter weather conditions can only add to the hardship and the difficulty of quick movement. This answers a question we did not ask, but we probably should. Why is Jesus saying woe to the pregnant women? In Matthew, a lot of the woe there is sort of like you have done wrong, so woe to you. This doesn't seem to have that same sense, because it's not like you've done anything wrong by being pregnant or nursing your babies, but the woe is more descriptive in the sense of everyone's trying to get out of there quickly. And unfortunate for you, because if you're pregnant, you presumably won't be moving as fast. If you're nursing a baby, you've got more to carry, and same with winter. You've got more obstacles. So France brings that out, which is interesting, and he's got more on this. But that's just I find him to be very good on not only the Greek, but just in general what's happening in the passage. But other resources here as well that you may wish to check out. I'm going to end the recording, but then I'm going to stay on for just a moment. So if you are watching this on a recording, thank you very much for watching. The handout is here at this tiny URL, and you can email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com.